Hey freshmen, it is Thursday, September 9th, and I apologize. I realized I had not uploaded the lesson from Tuesday. So somebody asked me about it today and I was like, totally forgot to do that. So I am going to do Tuesday's lesson. Today in class, we spent some time talking about September 11th, and we spent most of the time watching a documentary. So I had at least one person zoom in on that. I'm trying to think. I had a couple other people gone. If that's something that you want to watch on your own, you can do that, but you don't need to. We're going to be spending part of next week talking about September 11th things as well. So you're not getting tested over what we talked about today. It was more of a stop and pause and reflect on September 11th, the 20th anniversary, which is this Saturday. I will tell you that I explained to the kids what the flags in the hall are. And so you've probably, in years past, if you've been at Lifeway, you've probably seen me out in the hall talking to the high school kids about the flags. You've probably seen those flags every year since you've been in junior high anyway. So this is the story behind the flags. I can't remember how old I was, but on September 11th, 2001, 20 years ago, I had two kiddos, Chapman and Cheney, and they were 6 months old and almost 2. So they're really close in age. And when I got up that morning, we were doing our normal routine. My husband had already left for work, and a friend of mine called me and said, "Hey, are you watching the news?" And I wasn't watching the news because I was getting ready to go for a walk in the double stroller with my two kids, which is what we did every morning when we could. And so I flipped the news on and saw what was happening. And when I turned on the news, they were filming in downtown Manhattan or New York. And I saw that the first tower was on fire. And they were talking about what it could have been. And at that point, they weren't for sure if it was a plane or an explosion. There were different reports, whether it was an accident or whether it was intentional. And as I was watching the news, I saw the second plane hit the tower. And it was just like, oh, this isn't an accident, clearly. And it was took your breath away to actually see it happen live. And you could tell that it was a commercial airline, a large airplane. And I called my husband at work and I said, "Are you watching the news?" And he's like, "Yeah, we're all just standing, staring at the television in the hallway." And my kids, Chapman, wanted to go for a walk, so I had to kind of put my mama hat on, and I took them for a walk, and I noticed there were no airplanes in the sky, or at least I didn't feel like there was, and we live close to an airport, so usually we saw lots of airplanes, but at some point, I can't remember what it's called, the FAA, whoever regulates the airlines, they had grounded all of the airplanes. And so I told the kids that on any given day there's a couple thousand flights going on, but in the movie we watched, it said that there were 4,500 flights in the continental United States that day that they had to either ground or wouldn't allow to take off. So they didn't know if there were other planes, and unfortunately there were other planes, but at that moment we didn't know that. So when I got back from the walk, I saw the first tower implode, collapse, and I just remember thinking, how many people did I just watch die? That's what it felt like. How many firemen just died? It was horrible. And I can't remember which happened first, the Pentagon or the tower collapsing. I think actually the Pentagon was hit next, and then the towers collapsed. And so I just knew we were at war. I didn't know why or who, if it was China or Russia or North Korea. I didn't know. But it wasn't very long before we started hearing the name Osama bin Laden. And the airlines knew pretty quickly that they had manifestos for all of those flights, the first two that hit the towers, and then of course the Pentagon, and then there was another one that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania that was taken over by the passengers once they figured out what they were going to be used for. They think that airplane was going to hit the Capitol building. So anyway, they pieced together that several of the people on those planes had a sketchy background and that they might be radical Islamists that were carrying out a terrorist attack. Osama bin Laden was a name very familiar to the intelligence community, and they connected the dots. He was in Afghanistan. He was training terrorists there. He was a thorn in the side of the American military, the American intelligence communities, and they suspected that he was guilty. I hear my dogs crying over here. I may have to let them out. Hold on just a second. They'll start barking. Come on, guys. Outside. Oh, what do you see? Okay, sorry about that. Little stinkers. Right before I started recording this video, the UPS guy came and all of a sudden they were barking crazy. Anyway, so back to my flags. The reason that the flags, let me tell you what those flags are. So the day after September 11th, once we knew who was responsible, and they did claim responsibility, the Al-Qaeda terror network and Osama bin Laden in particular, I went down to Lowe's or Home Depot, one of those, and bought probably the last flag that they had, American flag. Everybody in the neighborhood, everyone across the country, everybody was flying American flags, patriotically and just in camaraderie with the people of New York and the people of Washington, D.C. and the flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. So I decided I was going to hang a flag. I had a flag hanging at my front door, but it was like a garden flag, kind of a foo-foo mom flag, and I just decided I was going to hang an American flag, and I was going to leave it hanging until they captured Osama bin Laden. And didn't know how long that would take. It took a lot longer than I had expected. I think that a week turned to 2 weeks, turned to a month. We invaded Afghanistan. He caught up and run and was hiding in Pakistan. So a couple weeks turned to a couple months, turned to a couple years. And so my flag just got worn out and torn and tattered, and I just felt like I needed to retire it because it didn't look pretty anymore. It looked disrespectful. So I took it down, folded it up and stored it, and then I hung another flag. And then again, a couple weeks turned to a couple months, turned to a couple years, and we still hadn't captured Osama bin Laden. So I retired that flag, and so on and so forth. I went through 6 flags. The 6th flag was the final flag that was hanging outside my house in Kansas City. That's where I lived at the time. And on the morning of, I can't remember the exact date, but it was in May of 2011, 10 years later, they finally tracked the devil down, and he was killed by a Navy SEALs team, and his body was buried at sea, so they say, or that's what happened. And so I went through a lot of flags, and so my intention was to properly discard those flags and burn them and spread the ashes at Ground Zero when I visited New York City. But as it turned out, the people or the police and security in New York City at the memorial would not appreciate me showing up with a bag of ashes. And so I decided that I would just hold on to the flags and then display them every year as a memorial to those very 10 long years when we were hunting down Osama bin Laden, and to those who lost their lives. And so that's what those flags are. And I'm just going to keep putting them up every year. And this is, of course, a special year because it's the 20th anniversary. So wear your red, white, and blue if you're at school tomorrow. If you're not, wear red, white, and blue at home and send me a picture. And then we're actually going to continue to talk about 9/11 next week. On our 9th grade field trip, our 9th and 10th grade field trip, I'm calling it field trip to Dallas in October, we're supposed to visit the George W. Bush Museum and Library, downtown Dallas. And when I made reservations, they were up and at 'em, but I checked a couple days ago, and the museum is temporarily closed because of COVID. I'm super bummed. I don't know if it's going to be open in time. We'll do something different, but in the meantime, I'm not sure if we're going to get to go in. But if we do get to go into the George W. Bush Presidential Museum and Library, or Library and Museum, they have a beam from the one of the towers that was part of the framework of the tower. And so part of the reason I go into a lot of depth about 9/11 is because of the opportunity to visit that museum. President Bush, of course, was president on 9/11. It's very, very moving. So I'm still hoping and praying that it will open up and we will get to attend, and we'll see what happens. So anyway, all right, so back to our lesson from Tuesday. So on Tuesday, we were continuing our conversation about the history of Israel. So I'm going to send you guys, you should have the PowerPoint available to you there. And I'm going to go through the fact of the day and everything with you, and then we'll wrap up our study of the Eastern Mediterranean. We should be able to wrap up next week. We didn't have school on Monday, so I've only got one day to catch up with y'all. Okay, so today's fact of the day is the Holocaust. The first picture that you see on the slide there, of the gentleman in, very, very skinny gentleman, all lined up. Most of them have shaved heads. They're wearing barely anything. Is a pretty famous picture from the Holocaust. If you Google Holocaust, oftentimes that's the picture that comes up. In part because they're fully clothed, but you also are able to tell the condition of their bodies because of the malnutrition and neglect and everything else that they have suffered. I would imagine this picture was probably taken during the liberation of the camps at the end of the war, just based upon their demeanor. They don't seem to be afraid or frightened for their life. And so anyway, I'm going to kind of walk through some basic facts about the Holocaust. I just messed up my PowerPoint. I'll come back to that. Anyway, I could probably spend a semester teaching on the Holocaust, but for our purposes, I'm going to just kind of sum it up with some of the main points. So remember, 5 facts, complete sentences. This would have been for Tuesday, September 7th. So, all right. So I classify the Holocaust to have started in 1934 and ended about 1945. Not all of your textbooks will say that. Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 in Germany, and he already had a kind of a plan in mind, and he began to instigate that plan in about 1934. He began to build camps that were labor camps, prison camps, political camps, to remove some of his opponents, and of course Jewish people he considered to be one of his primary opponents. So 1934 to 1945. Over the course of that time, about 6 million Jews were going to lose their lives as a result of the Nazi German efforts. And unfortunately, they're not the only ones with blood on their hands. There were several Eastern European countries whose police force, security forces also engaged with the SS in slaughtering Jewish people. So there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. Anti-Semitism is a word that means anti-Semite or you're someone who's against Jewish people for whatever reason. And so that's what that word means. So anyway, so 1934, Adolf Hitler begins that. In, I think it was 1919, Adolf Hitler was, I think that's the year. Sometime after 1919, he was arrested in Germany because of his political activities. Germany was trying to recover from World War II, and the Nazi Party was stirring everything up, so he got thrown in prison. And while he was in prison, he wrote a book called My Struggle. And in that book, he lays at the feet of Jewish people all of the woes of the German nation, the economic woes, the racial woes, just blamed it on the Jewish people. And so when the German people chose him as their leader, he kind of came in a back door, but he had a huge following in Germany initially, and they fully knew his position on the Jewish people. So they knew what they were getting, I guess you could say. Maybe not to the full extent, but so the initial plan, the German plan, of course, Hitler had in his mind a German empire that was going to envelop a lot of the countries around him. That was his plan from the get-go, kind of a payback from World War I. He wanted a 1,000-year German rule. And he set his sights on various countries, but before he did that, he wanted to get rid of his political opposition. And so he began to try to figure out ways to eliminate the Jewish people from the German population, because there were a lot of German Jews. And a lot of them were very patriotic German military leaders, public servants, civic servants, business owners, in banking and all manufacturing, all kinds of things. And so the first thing that he did was he called for a boycott against Jewish companies. claiming that Jewish businesses, claiming that they were taking advantage of the economic situation. And so that really hit a punch in the Jewish businesses. They took a hit for that. The next thing that Hitler did was he told Jewish people that they could not work for the German government. So if they had a civic job, a civil service job, which is working for the government, they were fired. Whether it be military or working at a desk job, they were fired. The next thing that he did was he forbade Jewish children from going to school in the public schools with German children. So he segregated them. So he's isolating them, and he's creating the narrative that he wants to create amongst the German population that they are bad and they are to be avoided. The next step was to begin to physically remove them from the country. He wanted to remove Jewish people from the country, and a whole host of different ways of doing that. Deporting them, scaring them, imprisoning them, sending them to labor camps, but he wanted to get them out of the country. But what happened was, as he began to invade countries around Germany, he found that he was invading countries where the Jewish people had fled. And so there were large Jewish populations. For instance, there was a significant Jewish population in France, and there was a significant Jewish population in Poland. And so it was no longer just okay to deport them from Germany, because now Germany is enlarged and takes up part of France and Poland. And so Jewish people began to have to wear a Star of David, a yellow Star of David patch on their clothing if they were asked by a German officer or policeman to show them their papers, and their papers identified them as Jewish, and they were not wearing a Jewish star. I mean, they literally could get killed on the spot. So they began to wear the Star of David everywhere they went. And then once, like for instance, Poland was invaded, the orders went out to round up all Jewish people and move them into areas of the city of Warsaw, in particular, as capital of Poland, into these areas that became known as ghettos. So 400,000 Polish Jews were sent into a very, very small, few block radius part of the city of Warsaw and forced to live there. They could only bring what they could carry in a suitcase. They lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they lost their furniture. German people, German officers moved into those homes, and they were forced to live in this area that ended up being brick wall built around it so that they couldn't come and go. Some of them were used for manufacturing labor and were brought to different industries and then sent back to the ghetto. But the conditions were terrible. People starved to death. They tried to go on about life as normal, but there was no way necessarily to make food. They had to smuggle food in. It was just terrible. A lot of children became orphaned. A lot of children showed up orphaned, died on the streets, seeing dead children, dead adults that were essentially homeless in the ghetto was a common sight. You'll see a picture in the PowerPoint of a little boy who's sitting on the ground. He looks like a skeleton, and people are around him while the photographer is taking the picture. I assume that they are hoping to be in a picture that gets seen by the outside world where they might get some help. I'm not sure why else they would just be in the picture. But so in about I think it was 1942, maybe 1943, Hitler's plan that unfolded was not just remove them from Germany, put them in ghettos and isolate them in outside of the German borders in Poland and France, which was becoming part of the German Empire. But they began to develop a railroad system that would transport Jewish people in these large city ghettos to concentration camps or death camps. They actually created a railroad systems to take political prisoners, which at the time was primarily Jewish people, to these death camps. Some of them were labor camps and death camps. Of course, the Jewish people were only hearing rumors of this. They didn't know if it was true or not. They were hoping to survive the war in the ghetto, even though the conditions were terrible. And this was this decision to annihilate the Jewish people, basically a genocide of Jewish people, is called the final solution. And so Hitler and his leaders moved towards the final solution, which essentially meant we will remove them from these cities in our empire and we will send them to death camps where we will kill them and then maybe get rid of the evidence. And so They were put onto railroad cars. They were told, take your suitcases, take what you can. We're sending you out to the country because the Allies are getting close, and we need to get you out of the city. You'll enjoy it better out in the country. And so a lot of them willingly went onto these railroad cars thinking that they were being rescued or sent to the countryside, but where they were actually being sent was to Krakow or Auschwitz. There were all kinds of death camps all over, especially Eastern Europe. And so there's a picture in here of Auschwitz, and you'll notice there's two pictures. One today of Auschwitz, it's a museum where you can actually go see it, and they've left the railroad tracks and everything intact. And then the other one are the people that have just arrived, and they're separated into a line of women and children and a line of men. Most of the people you see in that picture are probably, most of the women anyway, are probably going to be killed within the hour, most likely. So what they would do is they would divide the children and women to one side, the men to the other. They might take a few of the men who looked like they were physically fit and could do some labor, because there was a lot of physical things that needed to be done in the camp, especially involving the gas chambers and the things that they used to kill people. And so the women and children and some of the older men and younger boys would be sent to what they thought was the showers, the bathing area. They would be asked to leave all of their things in an area and told, you can retrieve those when you're done with your shower. They would shave their hair, telling them lice and fleas were a problem and they needed to get rid of their hair. They would take their glasses, and then they would give them a bar of soap, and they would instruct them to go into this very, very large area, kind of like the area of 2 or 3 classrooms at school, with shower heads in the ceiling, drains in the floor, posters on the wall that say things like, you'll get a towel when you leave to dry off, make sure you return your soap, those sorts of things, psychological things to make them think that they were just going to get a shower. But unfortunately, once the doors were locked, water didn't come out of those spigots. It was actually gas. And so the nerve gas would kill them fairly quickly. I won't describe how they died, but once everybody in the room was dead and the gas had dissipated, some of those Jewish workers, slaves basically, would come in and take the bodies to large ovens that were made specifically for cremation, and they would incinerate the bodies. Sometimes they would check to see if the teeth had gold fillings in them, and just sick stuff like that. And so this went on, and in some cases thousands of people were being killed every day. It's amazing that more people didn't die. And while that is horrible, I think that I read that about 4 million Jewish people died that way, and another 2 million or so died in these SS killing teams that went all throughout Eastern Europe and into all of these little towns where there were large Jewish populations, and would call them out of their homes and they would shoot and kill them. So probably upwards of 2 million people, 2 million Jewish people were killed in that capacity as well. There were other people that were killed, gypsies, political prisoners were targeted, but the Holocaust in particular refers to the slaughter of the Jewish people during the time of the Nazis in Germany. There was something else I was going to say related to that. Oh, the word Holocaust, if you translate it from Hebrew to English, means a whole burnt sacrifice offered to God. A whole burnt sacrifice offered to God, which is quite fitting considering how many of them died and were their remains were destroyed in the ovens. So you'll see some pictures there of glasses and shoes. Most of the Holocaust museums around the world have kept those. They were, when the camps were liberated, sometimes those things were discovered. They were essentially the effects of people that had been killed. I told the other classes, and I'll share this with you, one of the worst things I've ever seen, and I feel like I saw this at a St. Louis Holocaust museum, a large room full of human hair. I was told, and I've read this, that the Germans would send the hair back into Germany, where the hair would be used to stuff mattresses that German people would then use to sleep on, which is just horrendous. Anyway, ultimately, at the end of the war, the camps were liberated. How much the American government knew about what was happening is a little unclear. We definitely knew that there was large-scale persecution of Jewish people. I don't know that we had a full comprehension of the meticulous and the large scale, although we did have satellite images of Auschwitz and Dachau and those other camps that kept getting bigger and bigger, and we could see the railroad lines, and I choose to hope to believe that we didn't know that much, and so our silence was not as bad, but I honestly don't know. I know that President Roosevelt, FDR, significantly resisted Jewish immigration to the United States. In fact, there was a ship full of Jewish immigrants, or basically refugees running from Europe trying to find safe haven. They sailed aboard the USS St. Louis was the name of the ship, and the president refused to let them dock in any of the American docks, and so they had to go back to Europe, where about half of them were killed in the war, some of them sent to concentration camps. So I don't know, but I do know that a hero, someone I would consider a hero, Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who was the commanding general of the Allied forces at the end of World War II. He led the D-Day invasion in Normandy, and then he moved across Europe with, I think he came behind Patton's tanks, and their group were his men, American troops, were the first ones to come across the camps on the western and northern side of Germany. And Eisenhower, in his journals and diaries, General Eisenhower, who will be a future president, describes things that he never thought he would ever see with human eyes. He just was absolutely shocked by what he saw. And so, in fact, he wrote that it was so awful that he didn't think that anybody would believe him, that it was that bad. And so he ordered his guys to record everything and to take pictures of every camp they came to, because he wanted to make that available to anybody who might question or doubt that this had happened, and so that in future generations there could be no question of the depths of human evil. What makes the Holocaust all the more terrible is that Germany was a nation of academic excellence, highly educated, consider themselves Christian, cultured, music, the arts, beautiful modern cities for that era, yet they descended into some of them descended into the pits of hell. And so sad. But so General Eisenhower had these camps photographed and recorded on film for the world to see. So, okay, that's depressing. All right, I need to put my glasses on because I can't see my computer. All right, so that is our fact of the day. That a lot more facts than you need, but all right. Our first definition is, I have two definitions today. The first one is the word Yiddish. Yiddish is a language spoken by Jewish people in Europe primarily, that combined strong elements of the German language with the Hebrew language, and so it was kind of a slang Jewish language that was spoken all over Eastern Europe. Over time, it incorporated some other Eastern European languages, but primarily German. And then today, Yiddish is still spoken in lots of places, but primarily in Russia, the United States, and in Israel. And so I think the music department or drama department at Lifeway is doing Fiddler on the Roof, and I think that there are some elements of Yiddish that are spoken in that musical. And then Mazel Tov, which is an expression. It's a Hebrew expression. It's very Jewish culturally, but it's one of those words that anybody can use. You don't have to be Jewish to use it. Sometimes I will say Mazel Tov, which essentially means good luck, best wishes, happy greetings. One of the things I told the kids in class is that there's a Jewish expression that I use a lot, especially when I'm writing or I'm typing an email and I'm trying to express angst or frustration. I will say, oy, O-Y, exclamation point, oy. and I always do that. I think that's a Jewish thing too. I don't know, but it's definitely part of the Hebrew vernacular or the Jewish culture, and Mazel Tov would be as well. You'll hear it said at weddings and other things. So the definition says a Jewish phrase expressing congratulations or wishing somebody good luck. So Yiddish and Mazel Tov. All right. Okay, and then we jumped into our discussion again of the history of the Jewish nation. And again, I'll say it again, we're discussing this to make sure that you're good on your history and you understand the Jewish significance, the presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, politically and otherwise, and that you don't get suckered into thinking that there is no historical evidence to the Jewish nation, because there is. So I'm going to zip through it really quick again. So 2000 BC, God promises Abraham the land of Israel. Abraham's family multiplies. Abraham's family multiplies to about 70 people by the time they are reunited with Joseph in Egypt. Joseph takes care of the family there, has them come and live there, and over the course of the next several hundred years, they multiply to probably close to 3 million people. The Egyptians enslave them. Moses is raised in the palace with the pharaohs and the princesses, and ultimately leads the Jewish people out of slavery and out of Egypt. Between 1500 and 1066, the Jewish people settle the land. They conquer the Canaanites, the Philistines. They are governed by prophets and priests, and ultimately they pick Saul to be their king, and they unfortunately do incorporate a lot of the pagan practices of the nations that they have conquered. In 1066, after a several-year battle with Saul, King David becomes king of Israel after he's anointed by Samuel to be king, and he makes Jerusalem his capital city. Jerusalem means the city of peace. And he rules during a time of not relative peace. There's a lot of blood on David's hands as far as militarily, but God tells David that he wants Solomon to be the one to build his temple where his presence will be. And so after David dies, his son Saul becomes king. He rules for 40 years, and during a time of peace, Solomon starts out strong, but unfortunately he gets snickered by the ladies and takes on, I don't know, several hundred wives, and makes alliances with the kingdoms around him, and he just really ends life bad. And so unfortunately that part of that was not raising kids that could get along. So there's a division between his sons and the leaders of the country, and the kingdom is divided into two. The northern kingdom maintained the name Israel. The southern kingdom maintained the name Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. And over the course of not too many hundred years, the northern kingdom continues to descend into just a terrible pagan practices, and they are exiled in 721 BC by the Assyrians, which was part of God's punishment for not doing what he said. The southern kingdom lasts a little bit longer, but about 150 years later, King Zedekiah rejects to believe God that he should submit to Nebuchadnezzar, and unfortunately the Babylonians come in and they exile and crush the southern kingdom. And so between 721 BC and 586 BC, the Jewish people are exiled out of the land that they had been promised because of their sinfulness, and that is called the diaspora. Let's see here, and I can't remember if this is, I think this is the new part. So after they are exiled to Babylon, the southern kingdom, there was a prophecy, and I think Jeremiah prophesied that God's anger and punishment would only last 70 years, and then God would begin to bring them back to the land. And during that time, Daniel was serving the Babylonian kings and the Persian kings faithfully. And when Cyrus the Great became king of Persia, the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and they set up shop in Babylon. And for whatever reason, Cyrus the Great, the first Persian king, it shows favor to the Jewish people, and he allows them to start to trickle back to Israel, where he encourages them to rebuild the wall around the city, to rebuild their temple. You should know the names Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. These are all people in the Bible. Ezra and Nehemiah actually have books named after them. And so the Jewish people return to Israel, where they reestablish the sacrificial system. They rebuild the temple. Eventually, Herod the Great is going to really put his spin in gold on the temple. But the Jewish people no longer are autonomous. They're not autonomous anymore. They are still controlled by the Persians, later the Greeks, and then later the Romans. So they go back to the land, but they are no longer in charge of their own destiny. They answer to a higher empire. It's during the same time frame, 520 to 430 BC, that Queen Esther's story is told. She was married to King Xerxes. After a course of beauty treatments, he chooses her, not knowing she's Jewish, and the evil Haman tries to have all the Jewish people killed. He kind of tricks the king, and then Esther basically petitions the king for mercy for her people, which he grants her in a strange turn of events. So all of those things happen during the same time frame. Esther's husband, the King Xerxes I, was actually the great-grandson, I believe, of Cyrus the Great. So there's a connection between Esther and the first Persian king. Okay, and then we have kind of this big gap in Jewish history. It's called the Silent Years. So the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, the prophet Malachi, was written and completed about 400 years before the birth of Christ, and then there's silence. God doesn't speak through the prophets for 400 years. In the meantime, the Jewish people are sprinkling back in from different places, and they're reestablishing their homes and their sacrificial practices, and Jerusalem as the festival, a place of festivals. They're still under the authority of the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans come in. So this whole time, that 400 years of silence where they are wondering where God is, they are ruled over by other empires. And this is called the Silent Years. But the Silent Year is burst when Jesus is born. And so prophet and priest and king show up on the scene. And on our calendar, we refer to this as 0, but it's celebrates the birth of Christ. And so God is no longer silent. He speaks with the word of God. Of course, 33 years later, Jesus is crucified. His followers are all Jewish. And so the church, what we refer to the church age, those original followers of Jesus who started Christianity, are all Jewish, including Jesus. Of course, he after his crucifixion, he is resurrected, and he instructs his disciples, his Jewish disciples, to go outside of the boundaries, the borders of Israel, to all nations, and share with all nations the gift of the gospel. So Christ ascends back to heaven in 33 AD. Between 33 AD and 70 AD, when Jerusalem is destroyed, is when the church is growing and multiplying, primarily amongst the Jewish population. And there, you'll see the slide here, but the event that 50 days after the crucifixion of Christ, because Jesus was crucified on Passover, the Jewish people celebrate something called Pentecost. And Pentecost means 50 or 50 days. And so it's 50 days after Passover. So we know it was 50 days after the crucifixion of Jesus. And he had ascended 40 days after, he went back to heaven 40 days after his resurrection. And so this is probably about 10 days after they've seen Jesus for the last time. And he has promised them that he's going to send them someone, the Holy Spirit. And so they're kind of sitting around waiting, and they're in the city of Jerusalem, and they're meeting in an upper room is how it's described. And then the Bible describes a scene where flames that look like tongues are coming into the room, and the disciples are speaking foreign languages that they don't even know. They're speaking in the languages and sharing the gospel, and the people on the street think they're drunk, but it's only like 12 o'clock, and so Peter talks to the crowd in all of the languages. They all hear whatever they need to hear, and they're cut to the heart. The Bible says that there are people at the Pentecost Festival in Jerusalem from as far away as Cappadocia, in Rome, and there's people from Ethiopia. They're all Jewish, practicing Jewish people, and they come to Jerusalem to celebrate, and they hear the gospel, and it says that 5,000 of them believed and were saved. What? Can you imagine? And so the church is exploding. And then shortly thereafter, Saul, who is out to get the Jewish Christians, is converted on the road to Damascus, and he takes the gospel to the Gentile world. He travels all over Turkey and plants churches everywhere. He travels up to the islands. He travels to Cyprus. He travels to Rome and plants churches everywhere, and he uses the Roman roads to traverse and share the gospel with the Gentile people. He even goes to Athens. He's a world traveler. And so in the class, we actually watched a couple of cool scenes from the Bible series, and I'll see if I can find a couple of them on YouTube. I don't know if you own that series, but the one of the Apostle Paul is really, really moving. I would love for you to be able to see it, so I'll see if I can find that. Okay, all right, then sadly, in 70 AD, probably, well, Paul is probably dead at this point, but we're not sure. He is most likely in Rome, but Jerusalem is destroyed. And Jesus predicted it would be destroyed because of their hard hearts and the fact that they had conspired to kill the Messiah. Whole bunch of bad stuff. And so Jesus predicted that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And so just like not poor Nebuchadnezzar, but just like Nebuchadnezzar just decimated the Jewish people, the Roman general Titus marches on Jerusalem. He's sick and tired. The Romans are sick and tired of dealing with the Jewish rabble, as they would say, always causing trouble. And so they just decided, we're just going to destroy the city. We're going to destroy that religious temple that they use. And we're going to take them, disperse them back outside of the land so they will not be trouble to us anymore. And so Titus marches down. He destroys the temple. Not one stone is left unturned. He takes the temple menorah and the showbread table and the silver trumpets and the goblets and everything associated with the temple that's of any value that Herod had crafted, probably created for the temple. And he takes it back to Rome in a big celebratory parade. It's during this time, right shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, that the events that we talked about at Masada. So the Jewish zealots that were held up in Jerusalem when the city began to be destroyed, they fled the city and they went to the top of Masada. There's a picture there of Masada. And so going back to Titus really quick, Titus is going to become emperor of Rome for a couple of years. And I do have a video that I want you to watch on this. In order to capitalize on this big success of destroying and this uprising in the Jewish Palestine, or Jewish land of Israel, and a Roman arch was erected in the city of Rome. It's right by the Colosseum. The Colosseum wasn't built yet, and Titus's brother finished it. But it actually, in stone, there's a picture of Titus's victory and him confiscating the menorah and all the Jewish things from the temple. If you ever go to Rome, you can stand there and see it for yourself. So when peoples and nations claim that there is no Jewish history, legit Jewish history in the land of Israel, there's actually evidence of it inscribed in an arch in the city of Rome. Kind of crazy. Anyway, that's as far as we got in class. I didn't mean to talk this long, but I think your lesson will probably end up being probably an hour, 10 minutes once you watch the videos, or hour 15. So class would have been hour 30. So anyway, this is I think the last lesson that I need to get recorded since we watched the movie on 9/11 today. So anyway, I'll upload this to YouTube and I will get this on Google Classroom as soon as possible. Make sure you fill out the daily assignment log. And if you are going to be at school on Friday, don't forget to wear red, white, and blue. Bye.